Ave Maria.
Today we celebrate the feast of Saint Elizabeth of Hungary. She was born in 1207, her father being the King of Hungary, Andrew II. At the same time, the same year, almost the same day, in Thuringia, which is now part of Germany, a son was born to the Landgrave there. And for political reasons, it was agreed that the two children should marry. So 4 years later, Elizabeth was sent to the court of Henry, who was Landgrave of Thuringia, and to be raised in the court. And of course, it sounds really quite extraordinary to us, but that's the way they did things in the 13th century. So she grew up in the court in Thuringia. She was espoused, even at the age of 4, to Louis, her future husband. Her father used to send her an allowance until the time when the marriage would be solemnized. From her earliest years, she had a great love for prayer, and so she would frequently make visits whenever she could to any chapel or church that was open and to which she could go. And in her own room, she spent a lot of time in prayer, so much so that she developed a relationship with her guardian angel. About the age of 12 or so, she began having more control over her own income. She started to distribute it to the poor. And in her own dress, she was always very simple, except, of course, when it was necessary for her to put on her royal robes, so as to live in the court. And in this, she reminds us, of course, of Queen Esther, who, although she was married to the king, she always dressed in the most simplest of garbs on her days off, but she put on her royal robes when it was necessary. At the age when, as her marriage approached, at the age of 14, she entered into, on a particular feast of our Lord, when the whole court was present, she entered into the chapel in the same dress as her brother's sister. Now, in the meantime, her father-in-law to-be had died. Henry was dead, and so his widow was now in charge of the kingdom. That is Louise, her husband-to-be's mother. And she entered into the chapel in the same dress as her Louis' sister. And the mother was quite startled by this, first of all. But then Elizabeth took off her crown. And the mother asked her, "Why are you doing that?" And she says, "How can I wear a jeweled crown when my Lord is wearing a crown of thorns?" And from that moment, an enmity began with her sister-in-law to be and her mother-in-law to be. This enmity would begin with this extreme persecution. And from that moment, they started to, the mother-in-law to be, started to make plans to prevent the marriage. And they would say that she was not fit to be the wife of the Landgrave, Louis. Louis, in the meantime, had been sent away so as to train in military arts. And so when he returned and he heard the rumors how she seemed more to be like a nun than a princess, he said that this is exactly the kind of wife he wanted, and so he married her. They were to have 3 children, and she had such an influence on her husband that he became known as Louis the Pious. But the persecution did not stop, especially as she, now having greater freedom, she looked after the poor. She built a hospital at the foot of the hill on which the castle was built. And there, the poor, the lepers particularly, would come, and she would look after them with her own hands. She spared no expense, often going without sleep, and certainly when she ate privately, she ate the most frugal meals. And even when there was the ceremonies of the court, the festivals, she always managed to find some stratagem, some trick by which she could avoid eating. And she would do this often by actually serving the guests herself, which did not endear her to her enemies. Her husband decided to go on one of the Crusades, and so he joined the army of the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. And before they even left Italy, he contracted a sickness, a fever, and he died. And so she was left without a husband, a widow, and she was about 20 years old. She was grief-struck by this. Her son was too young to take charge of the kingdom, and so the nobles arranged for her brother-in-law, Louis's brother, to take charge of the kingdom. And what did he do? His first act was, in fact, to expel her. So she literally was thrown out of the castle. And with nowhere to live, she went into the home of a poor woman and spent the night. That's how bad it was. And the following day, she went about looking for somewhere to stay, to find that the order had been given, no one was to give her refuge. So she was completely abandoned, having nowhere to stay. She found refuge with the Franciscans, and they were very nervous about it because the law was given that no one was to give her any refuge, any sanctuary. And then suddenly she saw her 3 children. They came to her. They were now thrown out of the castle. And so she had to find somewhere for her to stay. And although she had helped so many people, so many poor people, no one was willing to give her assistance. So afraid were they of the vengeance that could be taken by the new Landgrave. However, in all of this, she remained completely tranquil. In the midst of adversity, she trusted in God. Eventually, she did find some refuge with the Franciscans at the very edge, at the very frontier of the territory of Thuringia. And then her uncle, who was the Bishop of Bamberg, offered her assistance, which she accepted. All the time she was praying for the conversion of her brother-in-law, because she saw that his injustice would in fact lead him to hell. And in due course, in fact, when her husband's body was being brought back to Thuringia for burial, all the nobles had gathered because, one, he was known as Louis the Pious, and he was also regarded as a saint, also because of his status. And when the body arrived at Bamberg, the nobles from Thuringia came to collect the body, And there the conversion began of her brother. The noble's maid asked her what did she want, and she said that all she wanted was, in fact, that her children might not be, that her son would not lose his rightful succession as Landgrave. And quite remarkably, her brother-in-law agreed. And so for herself, she said nothing. She would remain a Franciscan. And in the last years of her life, she continued her work of charity to the poor. And she died at the age of, in fact, she predicted her death. She said that she gave the date of her death. And 4 days after she gave this prediction, she fell ill. She was sick for 12 days. And then 4 days after she received the last sacrament, she passed into eternity. She was buried. And immediately the miracles began. One of them, a poor woman came to the tomb with a son who was born blind. And she took some of the dust on the tomb and put it in the child's eyes. Immediately the child saw. The told scales fell off his eyes and he was able to see clearly. But that was not all. Another woman came with her son who was dead, and the body stiff, and laid it on the tomb of Saint Elizabeth. And the next morning, the child was found to be in perfect health. Another case of a boy who was drowned. The mother brought the body to the tomb, and again, the child rose from the dead. Another, and this was the most spectacular, because this was what caused many conversions, was a young man had died, and he was actually being carried to be buried. And as they passed the tomb, the young man got up. It was this that led to her canonization about 6 years later. And even after that, many miracles are attributed to her. What was her main characteristic? It was, in fact, the love of God. And it was this love of God which was manifested in her devotion to the poor and to the sick. She would let no adversity separate her from the love of God. She saw everything that happened to her as part of the divine will, which she freely and readily accepted. But she also practiced, and for us today, when we think of this corporal works of mercy and we are asked to help the poor, it's very difficult in our time, in as much as we don't encounter the poor so easily. Two, the state has taken care of the poor. And so we think, well, how can we, in fact, practice the corporal works of mercy, namely to feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, shelter the homeless, and so on, because these things are being done by the state. But there are ways in which we can do it, and that is by practicing the spiritual works of mercy, namely to instruct the ignorant. And how many millions are ignorant of the faith? More than we can possibly imagine. We also instructed to counsel the doubtful and to admonish the sinner, to warn the sinner. All of these Saint Elizabeth did. But in our days, we have a perfect opportunity in which to practice these three, because in the life issues, there are so many who simply do not know that it is wrong to kill the innocent, whether they are unborn or whether they are long-born, whether they are in the womb or whether they are in the nursing homes. Many people simply don't know that, and so it's our duty to instruct them. To counsel the doubtful when women are concerned about an unplanned pregnancy. This is our task. We can, in fact, obtain the graces that are so necessary for our own salvation by counseling the doubtful. Warning the sinner when people live in immoral lives, and certainly we know in our own time how many laws there are that codify immoral living. Again, we can speak out boldly on this issue, admonishing the sinner. We also are instructed to comfort the afflicted. And as we know, post-abortion trauma is a serious issue. Those who are troubled by attempts with illnesses and so on, attempted to commit suicide. This is also a way in which we can comfort the afflicted. In the case of Saint Elizabeth, she not only bore wrongs patiently, her own family, by marriage, had treated her so terribly. But she did not, she just bore it, constantly praying for them. And what's even more striking, she forgave offenses. And in this way also is one of the spiritual works of mercy which we can do. And then, of course, the last of them, which is to pray for the living and the dead. And so when we do this, we are also succoring those who are quite unable to help themselves, because we do not go to heaven alone. No one goes to heaven alone. We always go to heaven in the company of others, those whom we've assisted by our prayers or those who have assisted us by their prayers. And so in praying for the living and the dead, we are in fact paving our way to the blessed kingdom. Let us then ask the intercession of Saint Elizabeth in our own time, that we might recognize those who are truly poor. And as Mother Teresa of Calcutta said, the poverty of our time and in the West is not material poverty, but poverty of spirit, not recognizing where our true riches lie, namely in the poor of Christ. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Santa Maria.